And with that, I know you're still admitting people, Chaz, but I can also see it and try to admit people as they come up. So
Okay,
let's have you go
I'll
ahead and
turn
kick
that
it
over to
off.
you and let's get the show on the road. All right. Good evening and welcome to this evening's panel discussion featuring RPCV perspectives from Ukraine. My name is Charles Feinstein. I'm the president of the Santa Barbara Peace Corps Association, which is co-sponsoring with the Alliance for Ukraine tonight's presentation. In addition to the members of the Alliance joining us today, I'd like to extend a special welcome to participants from the Northern California and Sacramento affiliate groups. There's a common English expression, may you live in interesting times, which, while seemingly a blessing, is sometimes claimed to be a translation from a traditional Chinese curse. But regardless of that phrase's derivation, we do indeed live in interesting times, and I'd have to say at times we appear to be cursed. On the latter, I think of the COVID-19 scourge and even fresher in our minds, of course, the ongoing conflict in the Ukraine. While this century is still young, to my mind, there's no event in recent history more significant and for many more tragic than what is occurring in Ukraine today. And as my colleague Naomi Kovacs first proposed, what better way to understand the country and the war's impacts than through the eyes and words of returned Peace Corps volunteers who served in Ukraine. The Alliance for Ukraine has assembled an outstanding and diverse panel of 5 RPCVs to share their insights with us this evening. We'll have an hour of guided panel discussion, followed by close to a half hour of questions and answers with the panel. We'll be monitoring the Zoom chat for your questions, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand on camera or electronically through Zoom, and we'll also recognize you for your question.
Let's do that through, I'm sorry, Chaz, through hands raised on the app. It's too hard. I can't see all of the people on the screen.
So, okay, so please just raise your hand on camera if you want to ask a question.
No, on the reaction, you raise your hand, not on screen.
Oh, sorry. Okay, use the Zoom app to raise your hand and we'll recognize you, or send your question through the chat function. So with that clarification, it's now my pleasure to introduce and turn over the floor to Courtney Copeland, President of the Alliance, who will present the panel and moderate the discussion. Courtney.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to host this event. I'll see if I can advance slides and talk at the same time. There we go. My name is Courtney Copeland. I served in Peace Corps Ukraine from 2017 to 2019 in Cherkasy, right there in the middle of the country. There's a picture of me hanging out on the beanbag with my amazing colleagues at the Cherkasy Urban Institute. They're still working today. And I want to bring us straight away to our panel to get to the meat of our discussion. So we're going to introduce folks one at a time. And we really wanted to bring together a group who span decades of service in Ukraine and whose communities are all across this big country. So I'll prompt you guys, take about a minute to introduce yourselves, who you are, where you served, a little bit about that community and what you're doing now. And let's begin with, I think it's going to be Natasha.
Hi, my name is Natasha Wanchek. I was a PCV from 1999 to 2001, and I later went back as a trainer in 2002. I was an NGO facilitator. It was part of the Peace Corps' Masters International program at Rutgers to get my MPA. But more broadly, I fell under community economic development sector. My site was Artemivsk, which in 2016 went back to its original name of Bakhmut. You can see it's in the east. It's in the Donetsk Oblast in the Donbass region. My placement was an NGO called the Environmental and Cultural Center Bakhmut, and you can see us there on it's Earth Day in 2000. We had a march through the market with the activists and got a lot of looks from people. My current role as it relates to Ukraine is to raise funds for humanitarian supplies for an NGO there. It's not the same NGO here in the picture, but there's a lot of overlap between people. And I've done smaller support tasks for the NGO people that I worked with.
Wonderful. Thank you, Natasha. Let's go next to Susan.
Hi, my name is Susan Vdovichenko. I served in Kherson, you can see it on the map, from 2003 to 2005. And I lived there as an English teacher trainer. So I worked with English teachers, and I married a Ukrainian, and then we've been back several times since. And the picture is my husband's grandmother and then 2 of our 3 daughters. We were in Ukraine, and that was in 2018, I believe. Since I came back from Ukraine, I have been, we kind of have one foot in either country. I pursued a PhD, and now I work as a professor of Russian language, literature, and culture, including a lot of what's going on in Ukraine in general and in Ukraine with the war. And as it relates to the war, since the war started, I've been doing as much fundraising as I can. We've sent a bunch of humanitarian aid over. I'm working with an organization in Kherson that has volunteers on the ground, and just trying to help people get through.
Thank you.
Oh, I also wanted to say, because we talked about the population, that Kherson is a city of about 300,000, or it was a city of about 300,000 a year ago, and now it's a city of about 80,000. Although since half of the region has been liberated from the Russians, the population is coming back.
And I know we'll have a chance to hear more about Kherson from you shortly. So thank you, Susan. And from Susan, we go to Susie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Susie Shevlin. I was a TEFL volunteer from 2007 to 2009 in Lebedin in Sumy Oblast. It's up in the top corner up there, and it shares a border. The oblast shares a border with Russia. I taught at a teachers training college there for 2 years, working with future English teachers. Since the war and invasion in last year, I have been participating as a virtual service pilot participant. So since October, I've been working with a counterpart in Mohildiski in Vinnytsia Oblast, which is right on the other side in Western Ukraine on the border with Moldova. And I've been working with teachers there, providing professional development and support to them as they're kind of navigating this, how to teach during all the challenges that have occurred during the war.
All right. Thank you, Susie. That brings us to Jake.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jake. I was serving in 2013 to 2014 as a TEFL volunteer co-teaching English at a specialized language school in Volodymyr. It was called Volodymyr Volynski before. Now they changed their name to Volodymyr, in Western Ukraine, Northwest Ukraine, right on the Polish border, as you can see on the map. And then I was evacuated in 2014 after the Maidan Revolution, and actually returned about a year later before Peace Corps reopened to teach at my school again, just because I wanted to come back. And then Peace Corps reopened, and so I was a response volunteer in the same school in the same town from 2015 to 2016. And now I am living in Lutsk, which is about an hour to the east of Volodymyr, because I am teaching and working with student life at American University Kyiv, a brand new university in Kyiv. But right now we're online, of course. And so I'm working from Ukraine in Lutsk, living in Ukraine, and I've been trying to help as much as possible. I was working at a school in Bulgaria, and we were doing, when the war started, and we were doing a lot of fundraising and a lot of taking in a lot of refugee students at our school in Bulgaria. And so I've been trying to help as much as possible.
Awesome. And thank you for joining us at what I'm sure is an absurdly late hour in Ukraine.
It is 3:40 a.m.
Дякуємо дуже. And that brings us to our final panelist, Dina. Dina, if you're speaking, you're muted. All right, we'll give it about 20 seconds for Dina. I know she was on here earlier. All right, well, while we're waiting, I know she'll hopefully be sorted out because she was on earlier. Dina served just shortly before I did. I think it was 2015 to 2017 in Kyivska Oblast in Bohuslav, and has since been really active in Reno, organizing, support and awareness raising So hopefully, Dina, we get her audio sorted out quickly, but I also don't want to lose time. So let's first do a little bit of context setting. So we're lucky to have people here who have a lot of expertise and experience in Ukraine. And we're just going to, I want to take it to Susan, since you have formal education at a high level in this space, and to Jake, since you're living there right now. Aha, there's Dina getting readmitted. Beautiful. To tell us a bit more about what's happening right now and why, and maybe some common misunderstandings. We only have a few minutes, and people write entire dissertations on this subject, but at least kind of a baseline. And maybe Susan, you want to take it first?
Yeah, I'll start. So, and I'll try to be brief. Ukraine has sort of always seen itself throughout history as in between countries. Russia has always seen it as Russia's little brother, but it's been a part of Lithuania. It's been a part of, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's Ukraine. The sort of the thread throughout history is that Ukraine has fought for its own independence, while everyone else has said, well, it's actually a subjugated part of our lands. And so in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine became its own country for the first time really in modern history. And that's when Ukrainian as a language started to grow. That's when the Ukrainian nationality, which had always been, I think, and people can jump in if they disagree with what I'm saying, but had always been fairly strong, started to strengthen. And I think the roots of the war began in that time when a lot of Ukrainians, especially throughout Ukraine, people have historically spoken lots of languages, but in recent history, Ukrainian and or Russian. And so there was this question, there are so many people who have Russian speaking roots and Russian blood, and are those people a part of Russia, and is Ukraine actually a part of Russia? And when I did my dissertation, that was sort of something I was looking at in 2010. I went to different oblasts throughout Ukraine. So in the east, I went to Kharkov, I went to Simferopol in Crimea, Kherson, and then Lviv. And I asked people basically, what language do you speak, and what does that have to do with your identity? And the feeling that I had when I did the dissertation was that Russian speakers felt closer to Russia and Ukrainian speakers felt closer to Europe. And what the people on the streets told me was, it's actually a very complicated mess. And they all, even at the time, almost all of them said, I feel very strongly that I am Ukrainian, even though I also have ties to Russia. When I was in Kherson in 2003 to 2005, that's when there was something that was known as the Orange Revolution, which in my opinion is sort of the precursor of 2014, which was the precursor of this war, which basically one man was running for president and he was quite corrupt about it, and he won. But the people did not accept the results of the election, and they took to the streets they took to Maidan, the center of Kiev, and protested, and the results of the election were overturned. And that was sort of a big step in democracy. And it was at that point that people really started speaking Ukrainian a lot more and feeling much more strongly that they were Ukrainian, and sort of rejecting the idea of Ukrainians being less sophisticated Russians. And so that man who won but then lost, that was overturned, Yanukovych, ended up coming back, and then he was at the center of the situation in 2014, which I think is, Jake, you were there for that, correct? So maybe you can take from there.
Yeah. So unfortunately, he was kicked out. And then due to political infighting of the winners, he won the next election. And so when I came in 2013 in September, came thinking, oh, I'm coming to Ukraine. This is going to be, fun, but a pretty boring 2 years of my service. Great, awesome. And of course, we all know that was not true. So when I came, it was around the time that Yanukovych had told everyone that he was working with the EU to sign an association agreement with the EU to have further ties with the EU, which is actually happening more right now, which is good. So they were looking more west. And then it was, I think, the day before or the week of the agreement where they were going to meet with the EU representatives. Yanukovych had a meeting with Putin, and suddenly did a U-turn and said, I'm not going to sign this. We're going to be a neutral party between both Russia and Europe. And that made a lot of Ukrainians very, very angry. And so many Ukrainians went to Maidan again and stood at Maidan and protested. And then it was originally a smaller group of students, and then they were forcefully beaten on Maidan. And that really, seeing these students beaten on Maidan by the President's Specialized Police, the Berkut, really got everyone mad in the country. And so more and more people kept coming to Maidan. This was going on through November, December. It was getting really, really big in December during our swearing in, to the point where we weren't sure if we could go to the embassy to get sworn in. So we actually got sworn in. Doug Teschner's here. He can agree to this. He remembers this. He had to swear us in during one of our trainings in Kyiv at the end of PST. And then luckily we were able to go to the embassy after that and get sworn in. And then we all went to our sites for about, I want to say, 2 months before the big events happened on Maidan, where more than 100 people were shot and killed. And because of that, that was when Yanukovych fled, because there was just because it had really hit a boiling point. And that was when we were all evacuated from the country as well. And then we were told we might come back soon, but then we all know the events in Crimea happened, and then the East happened, and we did not come back for a year. Peace Corps did not come back to Ukraine for about a year. And now we're there's been a slow boiling in the East, in the Donbass, for the past 8 years. And now we are where we're at because of all that's been happening.
And that brings us, I think, to the question of what is happening now, since the full-scale invasion started almost a year ago. It was February 24th. And so I want to start this next question with Natasha, and then we can go to Dina, who is back with us, had to restart her computer. And that is, how has your community experienced the war since 2014, when the conflict in the East started, and then since this full-scale invasion started in 2022? Natasha?
Okay, so to start, I'd like to say that Bakhmut really was a nice town. There's a stereotype about the Donbass being industrial, and it is, but there are also nice towns. And I always felt lucky that I was placed there. There's nice parks and buildings, and there were salt mines in nearby Soledar that tourists would go see, and a champagne factory. And there was and is a lot of pride in the town, and people wanted to stay. So I wasn't there in 2014, but I can give some brief context as I understood from my counterpart and what I've read. And there's a real distinction. The war started in spring 2014, and the full-scale invasion started on February 24th. They would never say the war started on February 24th. It started much earlier for them. Bakhmut was partly occupied for several months in 2014 by what my counterpart referred to as bandits from rebel groups. It wasn't the Russian army, it was supporters and people that Russia sent in. After liberation in 2014, after a few months, Bakhmut became the closest town to what is referred to as the Donetsk People's Republic, the DNR. And the closest occupied towns were only 15 and 30 kilometers away. So it was pretty close. And there were checkpoints, and a big change there was that there were refugees coming in from other towns and IDPs that settled in Bakhmut, and busy hospitals. And things have been quieter in recent years, but there was still conflict, and there's still checkpoints and people coming in to shop and access state services. So it was different. After Russia's invasion, some people left right away, and a lot more left in April and May. I had friends with older relatives who didn't want to leave, but they eventually did. The hope was that people could eventually return. But it seems to me that people didn't really think it would happen. My counterpart said that a week before the invasion, another returned Peace Corps volunteer did a survey and asked, are you planning to leave? And no one said they were, and that was a week before. Starting this fall, and especially this winter, there's been so much news about Bakhmut, daily articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post and internationally. And for a town with what was 70,000 people to have that much international attention has been disconcerting. And I've been saving some articles for them, some front page stories in the Wall Street Journal and things like that. There was one CNN headline from December 22nd. Zelensky thrusts frontline city and a symbol of Ukraine's resistance onto the world stage in U.S. visit. I mean, it's really, the town's really sort of become a symbol of resistance and sort of mythologized, and it's being referred to as a fortress. And I don't have much to say about the maps on the screen other than Bakhmut's right there, and it's sort of overwhelming and amazing that they've held the front line for so long. The most recent estimate is about 7,000 people remaining. And as far as how people I know have experienced this, they've all lost everything. They've lost their homes and their businesses and their town, and they're all IDPs or refugees now. And every day, because they're all NGO activists or journalists that I've stayed in contact with, they're all fully engaged, and they're reading the news and seeing the pictures every day for months, which is hard to imagine the stress for them. And even though they've left, but most of them are still in the country as IDPs, and they're still dealing with the infrastructure issues in Ukraine. So they've left to safety, but it's relative now where they've gone. But yes, it's a sad situation in Bakhmut now.
So you're mentioning all of these internally displaced people, and that brings us to some of the other parts of Ukraine. I want to turn to Dina now. You served in Bohuslav, which is in a relatively calmer region, but I understand Bohuslav has taken in a lot of people from around Ukraine. Do you want to talk a little bit about Bohuslav?
Yes, I'm sorry about my computer. I'm Dina Wood. I served in Group 48, which from 2015 to 2017, which was the first group in after Maidan. So we were being watched very carefully. I served as a TEFL volunteer at a humanitarian college, which is like a secondary school. I taught English to kindergarten and pre-kindergarten teachers and or possible teachers. Bohuslav is about 100 kilometers south of Kyiv. It's in Kyivska Oblast. It's very central. When I went there, it was Syriac speaking mainly, which is a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian, which was interesting at first. Since we were so close to, I want to just backtrack a tiny bit. Since we were so close to Kyiv, a lot of people in my town were at Maidan. A lot of people would go back and forth and were there. So they were very involved in the idea of Ukrainian liberation early on, even the Russian speakers and the Syriac speakers. My friend Sashko actually is in the film Winter on Fire being interviewed, so that's exciting. Even then, we had students who were IDPs from the East at our school, because so many of the secondary schools or not secondary schools, but the college level were not open in the East. So I had several students from the Donbass, and we had a few families there also at that time. But since then, after once the invasion began, an NGO I worked with, even though I was a TEFL, I had a very strong secondary project with a local NGO, and they have been working really, really hard. I've got some notes. I actually just finished talking to one of my friends there to be sure that I was going to get this correct. There was an influx of about 10,000 IDPs, internally displaced people, within the first weeks of the invasion. And this is a town of maybe 16,000 people. It's not really a city at all. And my college closed physically, as did most that were around there. And the dormitory was used and is still being used, I believe, for IDPs. And it was a big, the teachers cooked for them in the canteen. Honestly, from what I can tell, they were extremely welcoming. The NGO I worked for, Buslav Sich, over here, I helped get money to them through donations, and they also had other people doing similar. And they were constantly going back and forth, driving people out of the places when Chernihiv was going to Irpin, because we're relatively close, being close to Kyiv. A lot of people had relatives in Irpin, and it was just, they got working right away. They got volunteers going. As I said, there were 10,000 at the height. There are now 6,500 new people in New Bohuslaven who have stayed, which makes them 20% of the population of the town now. So it's a fair number of people for a small town agricultural area. What Buslav Sich did then was also start a volunteer initiative that they called Safe Haven, which engaged in humanitarian aid for all the IDPs and also for residents of Bohuslav, because people weren't working. So there were a lot of people who had no food, especially seniors and people outside of towns on the farms. So since August, they've organized and conducted a training project called From Ideas to Action, which is to socially integrate IDPs into Bohuslav. And it appears to have been very successful. It included a cleaning company that is now founded and run by IDPs, so that there is work. They created an educational space to help children cope with war. They've developed, actually interesting, a visual style and brand for the town, which has led to the creation of an art center for master classes. We all know the term master classes in Ukraine, but on folk craft, they've had festivals. Partly, they originally started to help keep IDPs occupied and something for them to do, but now it's turned into a big project where they're collecting and recreating local Christmas traditions, and the whole thing has led to an extreme strengthening of Ukrainian identity for Bohuslav. What the Russians have done in this town is made people feel even more Ukrainian than they did before. And those were all financially supported also by the European Endowment for Democracy.
So I see Susan nodding when you mention people's sense of identity. So I think I want to direct a question to Susan. And of course, we'll get to Susie and Jake. We'll get to you as well, or please chime in if something's really burning at the top of your mind. But Dina, you were talking about people's sort of individual experiences and their sense of identity. And so I want to hear a bit from Susan about the people you're close to, including people who've been in Kherson until very recently. And also, I do want to get these slides down, but it'll be hard for me to get them back up again. So we'll keep them up here for a little while. But Susan, you want to talk a little bit about the people who are experiencing the war?
Sure. As I'll just tell a little anecdote. In December, I was in Florida trying to be warm, and I was on a tram in a national park, and I saw a woman who I could tell by her accent that she might have been a Russian speaker. And then I saw her husband. She was probably in her 60s. Her husband had a Ukrainian trident on his shirt. And then I saw their car, and it was like wallpapered in Ukrainian stuff. And so I said, as one does, like, oh, hi, I've lived in Ukraine, and we sort of talked for like 10 seconds. And then I said, I lived in Kherson. and just like immediately everybody just felt horrible. I mean, it was just, it's like I hear about Boguslav thriving, or things getting stronger, and Kherson has just been, it has not experienced that in the same way. So when we're talking about people's identity, I know my grandmother-in-law, who was in that picture in 2014, she lived in Crimea. Well, she lived in Crimea in 2013. She lived in Crimea almost her whole life. And she left late 2013. She moved to Kherson to be closer to her daughter, my mother-in-law. And when Russia came in and stole Crimea, she said, I wish I still lived there because the Russian pension is better, the systems are better, and I'm a Russian speaker, and I feel like I'm a Russian in my soul. I've always felt like I was Russian. In late February of 2022, whatever last year was, she said, we will never forgive them. Almost everybody that I know in Kherson that I've been speaking Russian to for almost 20 years now won't speak Russian anymore. Even the people who felt like they were, and when I did my dissertation, I feel a little bit Russian, I feel a little bit Ukrainian. At least in my experience, there's none of that anymore. It is Kherson to Ukraina, Kherson is Ukraine, and it's not just that the identity has changed, but it's just been such a difficult time because at the beginning, the question is who was going to leave. Men couldn't leave the country because of martial law. And so families were having to make the decision, do we stay because the 19-year-old boy has to stay, or do we leave? And some stayed and some left. And then as things got worse, more and more people left, but who was left behind tended to be the people who couldn't leave. So they tended to be people like my grandmother-in-law who wouldn't be able to make the trip. One of my friends stayed in I'm sure it's the same in Bakhmut. The city's occupied. You never know what's going to happen when the air raids are going off constantly. I had a friend who died in her apartment because of a bomb. And so people are my friend was in a basement with 12 family members, leaving once a day. One person would leave once a day to get food. And finally, she said, I can't take this anymore. She took her 2 daughters and got in a passenger vehicle and drove across a pasture in the rain in a passenger car that was filled with landmines because to stay was not an option anymore. But she's 33 or whatever. And the people who are 65, 70 can't do that. So in addition to all the stress and the separation of families, the 80,000 people that are left in Kherson, a lot of them are the people who need the most. They need the most help. They need the most medical assistance. And it's just everybody, when Russia was kicked out a couple months ago, it was such a beautiful thing. Everybody was, I don't know if you saw footage, but people were, older ladies and men were rushing out and kissing the soldiers, and they were so happy, and there was dancing in the street. But the truth is, if you can see on the map, Kherson is right on a river, and the Russians are across the river. So there's still the bombs, and there are still, everybody has friends and relatives just across the river who are still in the same situation. So, how have things changed for the people that I know? I mean, it certainly forged their identity in steel. There's no question anymore of are they Russian or are they Ukrainian? And it's certainly, that which doesn't kill us, I guess, makes us stronger, but it has been harrowing for everybody, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And I hear from my friends in Ukraine who are in the relatively quieter places. Kherson has been so hard hit. And I hear them talk amongst themselves, like, even if we're having a good day here, we can't forget what's happening in other parts of the country. So for those of you working in Ukraine or with Ukrainians right now, I'm curious how your colleagues are doing. So let's maybe go to Susie and then to Jake to talk a bit about who you're working with right now and how that's going.
So I think I would echo a lot of what has been said for sure. Those experiences all ring true with the people that I know and I have been working with. In Vinnytsia Oblast, I mean, a lot of the Ukrainians I've been working with, they haven't been necessarily in the same situation they haven't been occupied, and they're not at direct risk of being occupied. And they have a lot of hardships that they go through every day or challenges that they face every day, but they would never complain about it or say anything about it because they know the experience of others in other parts of the country are just so much worse, or so much more challenging. Who are they to, complain about the air raids that they're going through when, people in Bakhmut or in Kherson are going through so much more. And I think that rings true even the Ukrainians that my teachers in Sumy Oblast that are under regular shelling. They are still comparing their experiences to others. So much so my counterpart broke her leg. She didn't want to tell us because she wanted our prayers to be for the Ukrainian armed forces and for us to not worry about her. And I think that's the kind of selflessness that a lot of the Ukrainians I've been working with have displayed. And then just the incredible circumstances that teachers are working under right now throughout the country. In occupied areas, teachers are having to decide, are we going to run Russians? Are we going to, collaborate with the Russians to have schools going on? Are we not going to do that? In areas throughout Ukraine, my college in Sumy Oblast, windows were broken out. There was structural damage to the building. There's no heat, no electricity, but they're doing online classes, despite these issues and challenges. If we're talking about power outages and issues with power outages, you're running an online class, the teacher may not have power, the students may have power, students may not have power, the teacher may have power. So there are these very complicated situations. And then, thinking about teachers in the buildings in areas that aren't experiencing such heavy shelling, they still have air raid sirens that are going on. They're taking their students to shelters. I know teachers that are counting down the days. It's been 2 days I haven't had to stop my class because of an air raid. They may have power at school, they may not have power at school, planning for all these contingencies and taking care of the children, which I think if we're talking about Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian culture, teachers I've been working with have been saying, the most important thing is our children, and teaching them those legacies, teaching them their culture and making sure that continues on. And so you have adults working in these situations, protecting the children, while also still having to manage everything that's going on with themselves as well. I don't know, I said a lot there. I don't know if somebody else wants to jump in or.
Well, I was gonna say that, Jake, you're also working with educators in Ukraine like Susie. So I'd love to hear about that experience.
Yeah, so I can talk both about my site because I'm still working a lot with those teachers, which is about 1 hour, like you saw on the map, 1 hour west of where I'm at right now. I'm in Lutsk, which is the main city in my region, in this little northwest region you see here. And so in terms of my region, as soon as the war started, a lot of teachers fled to Poland because they didn't know what was going to happen. We're very close to Belarus. We weren't sure what was going to happen with that. And so people just said, oh, let's just go to Poland. Let's stay there for a little bit and see what happens. And fortunately for teachers, but also unfortunately for the school, a lot decided to, for now, just because there's so much uncertainty, no one knows if Belarus will join the war as well. And even if they won't, there's still Russian soldiers throughout the entire Belarusian territory. They decided to stay in Poland or go further to Germany or Sweden. And they're doing work with Ukrainian students there, but still it's really hurt my school in Volodymyr. Plus, I think it's kind of that mixed with they just taught for 2 years during COVID, which was really hit a lot of schools in Ukraine hard because there wasn't the technology for that. And so just the past 3 years have been really, really hard for not only students, but teachers. And so right now, there's just a lot of uncertainty, just like there's been. And I think what Susie was saying earlier about like, you don't know if you're going to teach this next day. I can give you an example for myself. I've been planning to run free English clubs at my old high school in Volodymyr for the past months now. And every time we plan for me to go, even though it's only an hour away by bus, every time we plan to go, there's something that happens the day before and all classes are canceled that day or they're moved online. And so it's been impossible for me to run anything in person with students. And I'm just there for a free English club for one time. I can't imagine what it's like for teachers every day to not know, are we going to be teaching from the base? Are we going to teach from the bomb shelter? Are we going to have classes at all? This is just something that like you don't think about when you just think about the direct effects of the war, but these indirect effects are really not so good for students, for teachers, especially after 2 years of COVID. There's just been a lot of education loss. And so it's been very difficult. In terms of my university where I'm working at now, it's similar. More unluckily, a lot of my students from my university, because it's a university in Kyiv, a lot of the students are based in Kyiv. And so there's a lot more, there's been times where I've been teaching a class of 30 students online, and that day there's drone attacks in Kyiv, and so I'll have 2 students. And so there's been a lot of miseducation there as well for higher education, or internet will be bad, or there's just all these different things that are getting in the way of education. And it's been very difficult. But also you see this amazing resilience among all teachers in Ukraine, that they are trying to keep going. A lot of the teachers who I talked about who are outside the country say, as soon as the war ends, as soon as it's safe, I'm going to come back because I want to come back. My house is there. My home is, my lives are there. Everything I know is there. I prefer, like, that's what I hear a lot from a lot of people I know who are abroad now. They say, I prefer going back to Ukraine now. I want to be back. I don't want to be here. I want to be back teaching students at my old school. And so it's just, that's a big effect that's really hit even my region on the Polish border, as far away from the east and the south as you can get. It's still it has affected us a lot.
And speaking again of the East, you've described resilience, Jake, and that's a word I heard from Natasha when you were talking about Bakhmut. So let's go back to you, Natasha. And can you talk a little bit more about how you're collaborating with the NGO there? And we've heard a bit about the challenges of collaborating virtually within Ukraine or between the US and Ukraine, and you're doing some collaboration from the US with folks in Bakhmut. Want to talk a bit more about that?
Sure. First, I wanted to say, Suzanne said something interesting that I wanted to follow up on. I've never heard anyone complain. I'll ask if do you need anything? Can I do anything? And even if they only left with a suitcase, they'll say, I'm fine, I'm good, because they're worried about defenders. People in the West might worry about people in Bakhmut and think Bakhmut people have it worse. They're looking at people on the front line. And the NGO people will rally fundraising or efforts to help our boys. It's people they know, it's in their region. So it's an interesting perspective of who people are worried about and who has it worse, I guess. I also wanted to echo what people were saying about language, that when I lived there, everyone spoke Russian. And when people would ask what language I was learning, all I had to say was, I'm moving to the Donetsk Oblast, and it was Russian. And at least after 2014, maybe earlier, everyone I know switched to Ukrainian. Like, nothing could have made people feel more Ukrainian than these situations. For the NGO that I've been working with, I found them through my counterpart. In April, I decided to do some fundraising, but didn't know for whom. So she said that this group started in 2014, Bakhmut Ukrainian, and had a lot of community support after the war started. And all of their funding and support came from within the community. And I started doing fundraising for them under the Ukrainian American Coordinating Council and later through Rotary for humanitarian aid. And they're amazing. They keep going into the region. Frequently, they still have a humanitarian aid center operating in Bakhmut, which is hard to believe, but the woman wants to stay. I also more recently, I realized that about identity, several of the NGO members are artists. After 2014, Ukrainian traditional folk art became even more popular in the Donbass or in the Bakhmut region. And they would do exhibitions, and the NGO would promote Ukrainian culture and art. So I'm working with some of the artists and craftspeople to sell things here, and we're doing a fundraiser. And I just wanted to show what the NGO activist who stayed in Bakhmut made. I don't know if you can see it. So I have a bunch of dolls. Like, these are the traditional dolls, but there's also this one with the military outfit, and she made those in Bakhmut. So just raising awareness here and raising funds. So much about what's happened. People are they are Ukrainian. They identify as Ukrainian. They speak Ukrainian. And they just are focusing on victory. You know, Bakhmut is Ukraine. They don't need anything. They just want to win.
You know, you mentioned the folk art, which came up when Dina was talking about Boguslav, and that kind of brings us to our final question of this initial portion. We still have about 10 minutes, but it's going to take us about 10 minutes to answer. So we'll start with Dina, and then I want everybody to weigh in. And let's talk a little bit about how you're staying connected now with your community, regardless of where you are in the world.
I am staying connected. Well, I'm still working with this NGO that I worked with when I was there. Honestly, a lot of it has to do with middle of the night phone calls from counterparts that are breaking down a little bit and just need to know that somebody outside of Ukraine is listening to them, has not forgotten them. I mean, even though Boguslav, we may seem like we're protected, it's not really. I mean, as I'm sure Jake has mentioned, you know, there are, not to compare to what's going on in the war zone, but you know, there are constant outages, constant you know, psychological war is just as important in some ways for us to fight that, I think, with and that's the Peace Corps connection that we have. If we, wherever we've been in Peace Corps, the picture, one of the pictures up there is actually the day that Russia invaded. I was at school. I just finished my master's in journalism at the University of Nevada, and I went into school and I was just like a wreck, and happened to have a friend who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali and Ghana or Guinea, and I knew a Peace Corps person. You know, we went out there and we protested. It was the first protest in Reno, not our first support, but things like that. You know, I'm being involved with the Ukrainian diaspora, who's still doing support rallies, things like that. You know, I'm not doing the big stuff. I'm not raising $100,000 for guns yet or anything, but I think that each of us, and I'm sure there are Peace Corps volunteers from Ukraine who are on this, we each have connected. You know, I'm still connected with my host family in Chernihiv, and I did help her escape. Our building was blown up that I lived in Chernihiv, and so she needed a way to get out. Just things like that. You know, I don't mean to keep babbling, but I think that it's really important. And the thank yous you get from people are amazing. You know, like, I'm like, why are you thanking me? Because you know, I am part of Ukraine too, you know, and I think that's just what I'm doing. So I'm sure, you know, but it's something that we can all do. We can all
Oh,
keep.
I'm just helping people get out of a blown up building, small things. But Dina, I think what you're speaking to is that a huge community of Ukraine RPCVs, and sorry for those who are not Peace Corps affiliated RPCVs, returned Peace Corps volunteer. We often use that word and forget that it's not universal. But yeah, there has been this huge network of support, and I think it's hopefully going to keep going forward and have some good in the world. So to bring us to the end of this particular portion of our panel, I just want to hear from everybody real quick. What are your hopes for Ukraine? And you can take this in whatever order you want. I'd love to hear from everybody.
My hopes are, well, they're for Ukraine, but they're also pretty personal as well, just because I live here, I work here. I was one of the volunteers, like, there's always those Peace Corps volunteers that as soon as for some reason, a lot of Peace Corps Ukraine volunteers do this. I don't know why. I think it's something about the country, about the people. But as soon as I stepped foot in the country and was here during my dawn, I was like, I want to live here. I want to work here. This is my life. This is where my future is. I went to grad school in Budapest so I could be near Ukraine. I taught at an international school in Bulgaria so I could be near Ukraine. And so it's always been trying to come back here. And now that I have a nice, very fulfilling job teaching at a university, an American university in Kyiv, teaching these amazing students, working with this amazing Ukrainian staff. I want this war to end as soon as possible so I can, enjoy it, enjoy living in Ukraine with all the other Ukrainians, in becoming hopefully soon fluent in Ukrainian, just kind of being able to, just like everyone else who's living here, like be able to get on with your life. We just had, again, like I said earlier, we just had COVID. It was in Ukraine. I kept coming back to Ukraine when I was in Bulgaria before the war started, and everything was shut down just like in the US. And everyone had masks on and everyone was kind of just sick and tired of it, and they wanted it all to end. And then the war happened. And so I think just you feel this like kind of fatigue in the country of just like, we just had COVID, that was really fatiguing, and now we have the war. And I think everyone just wants this like a time to be calm in the country, to just kind of be able to live our lives here.
I don't have that much to say other than victory and peace soon, victory and then peace. And it's hard to imagine, especially in the East, what that will look like other than rebuilding, but people aren't really thinking about that yet. But that's what I would hope for.
My hopes are the same, and something I think it's hard for people who are not in touch with Ukrainians to understand is like, why don't you just say, take Donbass, take Kherson, just stop bombing Russia, like Russia, stop bombing, and you can take whatever land you want and we'll just end and it'll be peace. And I don't know a single Ukrainian who would accept anything less than the return of Crimea and the return of the Donbass region. And so on a practical level, my hopes are victory and then peace in the same way, because I don't think there will be peace without victory.
Agreed. I think my catchword would be victory as well. And I think I am also looking forward to just the revitalization and rebuilding that's going to happen after that victory. There's been such an explosion of culture during the war right now, and being able to see like where that's going to go in Ukraine's next era is something I'm excited about. And then I don't know if this is the best time, Courtney, but what Dina had kind of said about connecting with, Ukrainians want to know that people are listening to them or connecting with them, and the importance of that. That kind of spoke to me through virtual service. So there are opportunities. There are a lot of RPCVs that are on this call. There are opportunities through the virtual service pilot, through Peace Corps, to do short-term engagements with organizations in Ukraine. And you can donate your time. Yeah, there we go. You can donate your time, and it's 5 to 15 hours a week. And you can go to their website, you can check out and see what engagements are available. When I looked today, there are about 6 working either with Ukrainians that are currently in Ukraine, or working with displaced Ukrainians in neighboring countries. And you connect with an organization there that have had Peace Corps volunteers in the past. They've worked with Peace Corps before. And you get to use your skills and kind of connect and help people with what's going on there. But more importantly, you can make those direct connections with people. We had a session today, and it was a particularly hard day for the teachers I was working with. And one of the things that was really powerful for them, they were excited to learn, learn the new teaching techniques and everything. But at the end of the session, one of them shared, today, this session was the first time that they had smiled that day, because it had been a really rough day. And so I definitely, advocate for going out and supporting however you're going to support. But if you're looking to make those one-on-one connections with people and may not know how to do it, virtual service can be a great path for that.
Thank you so much for talking about that. We're on time, which is amazing. And we're going to go ahead to our audience Q&A portions. I'm going to actually take down the slides now and pass it back to our host, Chaz, to walk us through how we're going to do the audience Q&A. And also, you might notice my cats jumping around in the background. They get very excited when I'm talking to people online. And one of those cats is from Ukraine. So, all right.
Okay. Thanks, Courtney. So we've got, close to a half hour for questions and answers, and 2 ways that we suggest that you could be recognized or submit your question. First, if you figured it out on Zoom, you can raise your hand electronically, and then Naomi will recognize you and you can pose your question. And I see we already have one. Or you could type in your question in the chat feature of Zoom, and we'll also recognize that, and Naomi can read out your question to the panel. If there's a particular panelist you want to direct your question to, please so state, or otherwise we'll take it as a question at large to the panel. So the floor is open now for questions, and I see we already have a couple of people. Naomi, perhaps over to you now to direct the question flow. Thanks.
Okay, so thanks, Chaz. Doug Teschner, you had your hand raised first that I saw. Followed after you will be Barbara Hodgson.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for the wonderful presentation. I was country director there from 2010 to 2014. And I remember when I arrived, there was sort of this dichotomy between Eastern and Western Ukraine. And I guess some of the speakers have sort of alluded to this, but my sense is after 2014 and particularly the invasion by in Crimea, that there was sort of this pulling together of the Ukraine identity, even with people in Eastern Ukraine. And it struck me when early in the war, when Kharkiv was attacked, and Kharkiv was probably the most pro-Russian city in Ukraine, as I recall. And yet there was resistance there. So I'd be interested to hear a little, some people did talk about it, but I'd be interested to hear a little more about those of you who are there and how you see the Ukraine identity that has really been, I think, really developed. My sense has been really developed by these wars. Thank you. And thank you for the wonderful program.
Does anyone want to tackle that?
So I can just speak a little bit about it, because although I was only there for about, how many months, like 4 months, 5 months before the war started, or not war, sorry, before the events of Maidan and the evacuation happened, and before the annexation of Crimea. And then I came back after the annexation and after the Maidan revolution. So I wasn't there a lot before, but what I noticed is there was this kind of like, no one really thought about language, no one really thought about, and even in my town, in very, very on the Polish border, Ukraine, people were speaking Surjik, like Dina was saying, like they spoke a mix of Ukrainian and Russian. They wouldn't realize it a lot of the times. And then, but now, after I came back, you just notice there is a lot more pride in being Ukrainian. And I would even notice that when I would visit Odessa, which to any Peace Corps volunteer who's been in Ukraine knows that Odessa is a very Russian speaking city. It's like, I expected to, as a Ukrainian speaker, I expected to have a lot of troubles there. I wouldn't understand a lot. And yet when I was there, after we returned, my friend who brought me there, he was speaking to everyone. He's a Russian speaker, but also speaks Ukrainian. He was speaking to everyone in Ukrainian, and everyone who worked at all the stores were responding in Ukrainian. And to me, like being in Odessa and hearing Ukrainian was super cool and super just unexpected. And I think this just gotten more and more intense as time has gone on. Nowadays, because of, I think, laws, but also because of the culture. I was watching The Bachelor, but Ukrainian version on TV, Holostyak. And even then they had a lot of people on The Bachelor from Kyiv. And so they're speaking in Russian. But even though almost all Ukrainians understand Russian, they still dubbed it over in Ukrainian. And so now everything is in Ukrainian, which, by the way, as a Ukrainian learner, when I was first in Peace Corps in 2013, it was impossible to find any Ukrainian media to help me with the language. And so everything's been switched to Ukrainian. The languages, it's all another issue, but just in terms of like pride in being Ukrainian has really, really grown. I'm sure other people can speak more about that as well.
I actually want to bring us to a question from the chat, and then I know Barbara will have a chance to ask her question, but just because you started getting to this topic, Jake, we had a question in the chat from Irina, who's with Voice of America, and she wanted to ask a little bit about what we're hearing of Ukrainian language becoming more popular outside of Ukraine, with more people taking interest in Ukrainian, learning Ukrainian. And so I'll just bring up that question from Irina really quick since we were on that topic, and then we'll get to Barbara.
I think I can speak to that because I have, I'm connected to Russian professors throughout the United States in various ways. And a lot of colleges are now offering Ukrainian where they didn't before. There is a lot of, at least, I mean, anecdotally, there are people who are interested in it. And there are a lot of professors of the Russian language who are sort of questioning, not just of the language, but of the literature and of the culture. Like when we teach Gogol as a Russian, what's the word, writer, is how is that, how much of that is colonialization because he was Ukrainian, but he's always included among the great Russian masterpieces, and so there's a lot of that just questioning going on within the field itself, but among students, there's a marked increase in people who want to learn Ukrainian. I don't know what the numbers are, but for sure, people are much more interested in it than they were before.
I'll jump in on this too. When I started working with the NGO people in April, on chats, I asked, should we speak in Russian because I can understand a little, it's sufficient, and they didn't mind. Like they understood I could at least get by a little or edit my Google Translate. And after a month, well, maybe a few weeks, I just couldn't do it anymore. Like they all switched to Ukrainian when it wasn't their first language. So I'm learning Ukrainian slowly at the Ukrainian Institute of America. On Facebook, there's all sorts of Ukrainian learners groups. I mean, there's so many resources now, people talking about their Spotify playlists in Ukrainian, so many resources. And I feel bad that even for a few weeks, I was resorting to Russian because there's so much focus on Ukrainian. And it's interesting. I only know one person who is still speaking Russian. He's in Kyiv, and he's said he's fully Ukrainian, but he just couldn't get himself to switch, but he wants to. But because the language has been so politicized, and one of Russia's excuses for what they do. So much focus on Ukrainian. I mean, that just can't be emphasized enough. And I'm glad there's more resources.
I want to real quickly, because Irina also had a couple other quick questions that I think I can tackle. And it was, how many Peace Corps volunteers are currently working in Ukraine? What do they do? And what are your main goals in helping Ukraine now? And Peace Corps is not in Ukraine officially, other than through the virtual service.
I'll say
So-
there are still Peace Corps Ukraine staff. Yeah, there
But
are no
the volunteers are not there, right? Other than virtually.
Mhm.
But Peace Corps also had, just so Irina, you know, had evacuated all volunteers everywhere in the world because of COVID, and has just recently started reintroducing volunteers into countries. So we're in a, I forget now how many Peace Corps back in, but it's way less than it used to be. So the number of countries we're coming back to is creeping up. But I mean, because there is a war in Ukraine, I don't know when Peace Corps will be back there in person, other than the virtual service.
Virtual service was starting up because, like you said, everybody was evacuated in 2020. It was quite a harrowing time. I have a lot of friends who were there in 2020. And then people were starting and just getting their virtual service assignments and just meeting their counterparts when the full-scale invasion happened. And then their placements all had to be put on hold because everybody was fleeing. Everybody needed time to regroup. And then now it's still a very dire and dangerous situation, but now there are a lot of amazing virtual service placements that are there. Maybe now I guess we can get to the questions from Barbara.
Hi. Yes, I live in Santa Barbara. I've been a member of the Santa Barbara Association here for many years. I'm not currently a member, but I noticed you're recording this, and I'm wondering if it's possible for us who, well, anyway, the retirement community I live in has 8 Peace Corps volunteers living here. And we expect 2 more within the next 6 months. So we're a little group of 10 that meet regularly, not with a formal Peace Corps group. But one of my thoughts was that this might be something, if the movie of this program is available, that we might be able to show here at Val Verde, this retirement community. I think there'd be people that are interested. And I have to say thank you to the participants in the group sharing their knowledge. I'm captivated and how can I say it? So appreciative of what you've done in order to get the word out. It was a very moving program. So that's one thought I have. I'm also thinking there might be a possibility of creating a program at my church. So my really question, I suppose, is to the local Peace Corps group as to the availability and the legal ramifications of using it elsewhere.
Barbara, I'll jump in if you don't mind. Yeah, I think those are great ideas, and let's make it happen. I leave it up to Courtney and the Alliance to advise about things like legalities and restrictions. She's got 2 thumbs up. So I think we already solved that problem, and all really we would need is a venue. And if the venues you mentioned are willing to host, we can certainly make it happen. So please email me, or next time we're at an event together, let's talk and make it happen.
Okay, well, Naomi and I know each other because we served on the board together many years ago. So I don't have your email address, but I have Naomi's. So maybe we can connect through her.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Naomi, do we have more raised hands? Do we have more questions?
I'm not seeing other raised hands, but I'm seeing questions in the chat.
Yeah, so I see, Jake, you're responding to some questions from Irina on how students are doing. Maybe we'll bring that up out of the chat and talk a little bit more about that matter of how students are doing and what some issues are.
Yeah, so I've had the opportunity to teach in California during COVID, as well as
Yeah, probably.
Barbara, will you mute yourself, please?
Starting to walk back.
Hold on just a second. I'm sorry, I missed it. I got distracted.
Well, could you mute yourself, please? Because we can hear you.
I'm sorry.
I'm off mute, but not that it will make a difference.
All right. So I've had the opportunity to teach in a few different places during COVID and now during the war as well. And I don't, at least in my, so I can only speak from the students I know, of course. And so my students are, of course, I think a bit more privileged, and they're not in a direct war zone. We do have electricity problems, and my students in university are even more privileged because I think they're in Kyiv, or they've left, and they're able to get good access to internet. They have computers. But luckily, I think during COVID, a lot of schools in Ukraine really worked on improving education online just because they had to. And so I don't think they're as behind as they would have been if there hadn't been this this kind of background. Like COVID was terrible, but also if you want to see the silver lining, it was when the war started, all these schools had this infrastructure in place already to teach online. So that was a benefit. And if students had to leave the country, they were able to still participate in classes. The government of Ukraine also put out this learning program on, I think it was online. And so students could learn through this learning program as well if they can't attend classes at their school. Maybe they live in a rural area. Now, that being said, I can't say anything about the rural area because I never taught in a village school, or I don't know as many people in village schools. My town was 38,000 people, which in the West is, I know people who served in the East, they're like, that is a village. But in the West, it's a fairly normal sized town. And so because of that, I'm guessing though that just what I saw as how I know there's not as much technologies in the rural areas, I don't know how they were hit as bad.
Could I say something quickly here? I keep in touch with the teachers at this, some of the teachers that I worked with, and also just other friends who are teachers. And I'm agreeing completely with Jake that COVID really helped this in some ways, because they had been online back and forth so much that of course they feel like there are negatives, you know, as did American teachers who were teaching online. I taught online at the beginning of COVID. So I'm not sure that that's a particularly,
Of this staff.
you know,
I can't even.
meaningful, not to put down you asking it, but I don't see it as a huge difficulty. For one thing, a lot of my students were ahead of the American students who I'm going to compare them to. Anyway, in Bohuslav, I know they could only open one of the primary schools. They had 3. And the reason they could only open one was because it was the only one that had a bomb shelter, so that they could, if they got the warning siren, they could take the children down in the bomb shelter and teach them in the bomb shelter, which they did, and they continue to do. When the sirens go off, the kids go down to the basement. So I feel like the education system, maybe I'm just being pro-Ukraine, which I am, but I really feel that they are working very hard to make sure that Ukraine does not get behind education-wise.
Okay, I see Mike Marzola, you have your hand up.
Yeah, yes, I do. Hi, Michael Marzola, also in Santa Barbara, California. And excellent presentations. Thank you very much. I've been glued to my computer mostly, just trying to figure out what's going on and trying to stay up to date with Bakhmut and Kherson, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, here, having served in a Peace Corps, right? And here I am looking at a war and going, go get them. You know, it's just, I know it's a bit of a contrast, but go get them. You know, Slava Ukraine. I learned that phrase from watching so many videos from that part of the world. But I wanted to ask you folks, with experience having lived there, one, if somehow you could transmit some news sources that aren't the regular news sources, but are reliable. And of course, unfortunately, I don't speak Ukrainian or Russian, something that I could actually understand. That'd be one thing. And the other thing is NGOs that are operating maybe under the radar. I mean, I've been sending money to Direct Relief International, and I know they're doing a lot of work in Ukraine, but there's probably other sources that are maybe more direct on the ground. And I'm fascinated by this idea of virtual service. So if that could be posted somewhere so we could go back and study later, I thank you very much. And I will mute.
Thank you. I'll chime in real quick on that. We actually have a couple more slides I'm going to put up after our next and probably final question, so we have time. We have a list of English language Ukrainian news sources as well as journalists who are covering Ukraine that you can follow. And then we also have a list of NGOs ranging from diaspora-led, fairly large national ones to grassroots efforts affiliated with some of our panelists and NGOs founded by RPCV. So we'll put those slides up and talk through them briefly, and then we'll send them out afterwards. But let's get through a couple more questions and then we'll end on that.
Okay, Mike, you might want to unraise your hand because unless you have another question. Okay, I saw Frank Price's hand go up and then Sophia Lennox's afterward.
I probably have a zillion questions, but when the war is over, the war isn't over, how do Ukrainian students view Western support? Is it adequate enough? Do they? I know about the recent tank issue, but besides that, does it seem like we're giving enough? All of the Western countries?
My experience with people, and maybe other people have different ideas, is that it's kind of a mixture of intense gratitude and questions on why it can't be more. You know, there was that issue at the beginning of the war. Why aren't we closing the sky? Why aren't we, you know, making the airspace? But then I think the Ukrainians that I know in particular feel like Biden has really stepped up and has done a lot. And that's not necessarily like a political thing. I think when they say that, they mean the United States has done a lot. So it's kind of a mixture. Like there could always be more, but the Ukrainians I know are very grateful for what especially the United States has done.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of a mix of both. Like there's always, of course, they're very, at least the people around me are very, very happy that the support is coming. But of course, until the war ends, there can always be more, because for every day that the war keeps going on, more people are dying and getting hurt. And so I think it just, as long as people have this resources, I know war fatigue is really, it's real. I've noticed it even with a lot of my friends who are really into Ukraine. What I do is I set up a reoccurring donation, just to like, it takes it out of my account every month, because I don't even have to think about it then. And it's not like I'm like, oh, I have to send again. And so that's what I do. And I really push a lot of people to try doing reoccurring donations if they can.
What do you think? What did he just say?
I'll just add something to what Jake was saying about donation fatigue. For those of us who are staying engaged, finding new ways to get people involved or keep people's interest or keep eyes on Ukraine is something I've thought about. And part of my reasoning for doing an event this weekend focusing on the artists. So I'm not asking people to donate to the NGO. I'm saying, come check out all these great crafts and art from Bakhmut artists. And we can also support local organizations while we're having our, the restaurants bringing food, and it's a nice event. So it's a different way to try to engage people, which I'm still trying to work out.
Sophia?
Hi, yeah, I'm another Ukraine volunteer, Group 42, and I'm finishing up my Juris Doctor at the University of San Francisco, and I've been invited to speak at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva this March. So I put some information in the chat box there, but if anyone here, I mean, I think that you're really a perfect group of individuals to be able to contribute to this type of advocacy work because you're connected, you have an American perspective, but you're also connected to many different Ukrainian and NGOs and school children. And I'm specifically focusing on the rights of children in armed conflict and like grave atrocity crimes committed against children, as well as like the forcible abduction or transfer of Ukrainian children into Russian territories and subsequent like illegal adoption, which is typically an indicator, an early warning sign of genocide. So I know these are huge issues, and I think that whatever you might want to raise yourself, or if any of the panelists right now would like to address any issues that you've seen with that, any of those types of issues whatsoever, or just the impact of the war on children themselves and school closures. And I know that you've addressed this in some ways, but even if the infrastructure or electricity grid, or like how many issues are you having with remote education in itself, or any other, if there's anything that we want to bring up now, that's great. And anything that you would like to email me with, I'd be happy to hear you. And maybe I can just raise that point actually at one of the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, or at another session at the Human Rights Council. And hi, Doug Teschner.
Okay, I wrote you a message. Oh, sorry, Chess.
Yeah, I just have to jump in and remind folks, we have 6 minutes left in our scheduled time. So maybe one more question.
And Sophia, we can follow up by email because it would be great to get that message out and get some connections.
Okay, we have one more hand raised, and that's Tina Curry, but I also want to see with the Alliance if we can keep the Zoom open for at least a few minutes after it's over, because there's a lot of good chat going on and people may want to stay and kind of read through it if they've just been
I'm
paying
able to
attention.
stay on. We can keep the Zoom room open for a few minutes. We probably want to let Jake go to bed. So some of our panelists are on the East Coast rather than on the West Coast. So yeah, I can't say that all of us will be able to stay, but we can keep the Zoom room open for a little bit.
Yeah, just so people can read through it, because I know a lot of people have been very, paying attention to the speakers, but I'm looking at the chat and there is some really interesting stuff going on.
I will stay on. Some of the panelists who are in different time zones may need to go to sleep.
Okay, great. So our final question from the audience will be Tina Curry.
I'll keep this quick. I just wanted to know, like, final thoughts at this 1 year mark. What would be kind of your parting words or things that you would want the RPCV community, Peace Corps community, kind of think about, reflect on at this 1 year mark?
Jake, you did a fist bump. Did you want to say something?
I just thought that was a great last question. I was like, it's like, we got a new moderator here. No, Courtney's amazing, but this that came out of nowhere. I think, so I think just like for me, the thing to remind people is just like the war is still going on. I've noticed, like, I have a lot of podcasts from a lot of American outlets, and Ukraine, I mean, it just came back up again because of the tanks. But besides that, like, it goes away again. And being in the country is this, or like, even if you're in the US, but you're really following what's happening with the war, like there's this dichotomy of it's really, really big, and then it's not big, and then it's really, really big again, and it's not big. But to anyone who knows anyone in Ukraine, this war is going on, well, since February. This invasion has gone on since February, but also the war's been going on for the past 8 years. And this is still going, even if you don't see it in the news. So I think this is like a really good step for a lot of people to just remember that this war is still going on. People are still getting hurt. People are still dying. And so just if you can in any way, find ways to support. This could be, if you have financial means, support that way, which there will be a slide up on how you can do that. But it can also be talking about Ukraine to your friends, talking about keeping it in the public eye that Ukraine is still happening. This is still happening. The biggest land war in Europe since World War II is still happening. Possible genocide is still happening in the biggest country in Europe. So it's just really important to keep it in your head, even when the media has other things to focus on.
And I'll add and then transition us to those final slides, but especially for the broader Return to Peace Corps volunteer community, that this isn't just about Ukraine, and that chances are a lot of the countries where other RPCVs have served are affected, maybe directly, maybe indirectly. So for example, Moldova has taken in so many people per capita, and I know that Moldova RPCVs are really actively supporting refugees there. I think we maybe have some people on here who served in Poland back when Peace Corps was in Poland, and Poland has taken in so many Ukrainians, and it's it's stretching the resources, although they do it gladly. And then we look at countries elsewhere in the world. You look at a whole variety of countries on the African continent that are experiencing exacerbated risk of famine because we have Russia blocking grain exports from Ukraine. And then there's a ton of international students who study in Ukraine. And those of us who lived there met a lot of people who were on scholarships. They were studying engineering, they were studying medicine. They might have been from Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana. And a lot of these students are affected. And actually the Alliance has collaborated with a group called the Global Black Coalition, because you have bicultural Ukrainian families, or maybe an African student came, did their degree, liked Ukraine, fell in love, started a family, their children are Ukrainian citizens, but their family gets split up because somebody's not recognized as a Ukrainian refugee because of their passport. So chances are, like, it's not just Ukraine, and a lot of the countries that we as internationally minded people care about are affected. With that, I'm going to go back into having some slides. We might run just a couple minutes over time, but that's impressive given how much we have to talk about and how many people. So bear with me for just a second. Gotta monitor all these different windows I'm in. There we go. Okay, I think that's how it's supposed to be. Loading. Okay, so this gets to some of the questions people had asked earlier very astutely. Where to get information, and this list was come up with collaboratively by all the panelists. And so there's a couple specific journalists who actually have a Peace Corps background. So Terrell Starr, you can find him on Instagram. There's a link there. We'll send these out, or just look for him. He does amazing correspondence. He served in Georgia, but that ended up, oh, there's my cat, ended up working a lot in Ukraine and reporting a lot in Ukraine. And Christopher Miller, also a Ukraine RPCV, and Natasha pointed out, hey, he was also a Bakhmut PCV. He does amazing coverage. And then there's a newspaper and website called the Kyiv Independent. It was launched November of 2021, I think, after the Kyiv Post went through some drama. And so the Kyiv Independent is really quite a good news source in English. And then for those who are wanting to really dive in and sink your teeth in, there's an amazing online course that you can get for free by Timothy Snyder. This course is so good that all my Ukrainian friends are like, if you speak English, you need to take Timothy Snyder's course. Like, they're recommending it amongst themselves. So that's a really amazing course to take, just on, as it says, the making of modern Ukraine. I'll pause real quick in case somebody wants to weigh in before I get to the slide about, I guess, do you think we have films? Maybe I will carry on. Okay. There's a lot of, and for those of you who were interested in doing some kind of event or showing a film, if you can find these ones, this one, I can't promise, yeah, you can do this because it's not my content. But these films, if you can access them, really give an amazing insight into Ukraine, and especially the events that you've heard our panelists talk about today from 2014 onwards. Again, we'll send this out because it's a lot to take in at the moment. And then suggestions to donate or volunteer. We collaboratively put this list together, thinking through a few different categories. Firstly, there's these diaspora-led US national nonprofit organizations. A lot of them popped up after 2014. That's when you saw a big uptick in civic engagement and the need for support. There's Nova Ukraine, Razum for Ukraine, the Leleka Foundation. There are others as well, I know that Leleka and Nova Ukraine are actually based in California, for those of you who are in our California audience. Razom, I think, is based in New York. They're all amazing organizations. They, again, are Ukrainian-led, but based in the United States. Jake, you reminded me about United 24, which it's an official Ukrainian national donation mechanism. And I think you know more about that than me. So Jake, maybe you want to talk about that real quick?
Yeah, so they have, it was created by the president's office to kind of collect all the donations and put them where the biggest needs are. And so you have like you can donate to one of three categories. So one is like demining, one is rebuilding, and then one is medical and humanitarian help. And if you can add them also on, they're very good with on Instagram and Facebook, showing like what we've bought with this. They're very transparent with all the information. They just have started rebuilding near Kyiv, and they're showing like we've spent this much money to rebuild this many apartments, or they just bought generators, huge generators for a hospital in Lviv. And so it's one way to help support the government in them trying to afford things that the government really prioritizes.
And then we already heard a lot from Susie about the virtual service pilot, and there's a lot of information online through the Peace Corps Virtual Service Pilot Program, including openings in Ukraine, but in other countries as well. And then to continue on, there are a handful of nonprofits founded by Ukraine RPCVs. Of course, the RPCV Alliance for Ukraine is one of them. We're an affiliate of the PCA, and we are the country of service affiliate for Ukraine. Doug Teschner mentioned in the chat that we have published a cookbook that gathers photos and recipes and stories from Ukraine volunteers. And then it funds a humanitarian mini grants program that we launched last year. And then we also provide cross-cultural training for sponsors and beneficiaries of the Uniting for Ukraine program. There's Ukrainian Action. We actually just recently published a feature story about Ukrainian Action on our website that you can read about, founded by Ukraine RPCV, who was working closely with former Peace Corps staff. And then Ed's Friends Ukraine, again, also founded by a Ukraine RPCV, Ed Ma. I was just talking with him this morning, and he's doing like an art auction to raise money for equipment going down. Actually, he's sending stuff to Bakhmut. He's like, yeah, I have guys in Bakhmut today. I'm like constantly checking in to make sure they're okay. And speaking of Bakhmut, there was a couple contributions from Natasha. So maybe, I know you mentioned this earlier, just give us a reminder again.
Bakhmut Ukrainian is the NGO that started in 2014, and it's been really active with a lot of community support. They're now operating mostly out of Dnipro, but they still have a center open in Bakhmut. And they post lots of photos and receipts. They're very transparent, and it's a good organization.
And I think that's the end. There's a lot. You can find anything from the big international NGOs to tiny little grassroots projects to support. And so those are just a few. We didn't want to overwhelm people with options. And that brings us to the end of our night. So I want to, I guess, turn to Chaz to kind of close us out.
Thanks very much, Courtney. Yeah, I really want to thank Courtney and the panelists. That was for me a wonderful mix of hopefulness and, I'd have to say, sadness. We're at the end of our program, but perhaps it's only the beginning of our personal commitment to Ukraine. And you've just learned about various ways that you can stay connected. These will be included in the slide deck that we'll post on the Alliance and Santa Barbara Peace Corps Association websites. And by the way, on a personal note, I just watched Winter on Fire last week on Netflix, and the heroism of the protesters against the former regime documented in that film is absolutely inspirational. So I certainly recommend that one. It's very accessible. Courtney, unless you have some parting words, I would now like to bring our evening to a close. I'm sure I can represent everybody in extending our heartfelt thanks to the Alliance, the moderator, and the panelists. Very well done. Last but not least, a big thank you to you, the audience, for your interest, attention, and support. Do probachenia.
Do pobачення, молодець. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful morning, night, afternoon, wherever your time zone is. And for those of you going to bed, sleep well.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Героям слава.